So I'll monitor the lobby, Chloe,
Right.
and I'll come back to you with the Q&A and everything, and I'll introduce you. But let's submit all and see where we go. But thanks in advance again. So
Thank you.
morning, Adrian. Morning, David. Morning, Palwinder. Morning, Podrick. Morning, Brian. Good to see you. Morning, Chris.
Morning.
Morning, Salia. Great to see you. Thanks for joining. If you've just joined, if you could mute, please. There was a bit of an echo, but that's great. Thank you. Henry. Yeah, no, I think you're okay, Henry. Hi, Adrian. Good to see you. Good morning, Chris. Great to see you too. Morning, Bryn. Thanks for joining. Great to see you. Morning, Con. Nice to see you. You still got the Elspeth laptop then, Con? There you go. Inside joke, but there we go.
Sorry, she's in Italy with my one at the moment.
Oh, well, there we go. There we go.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Okay. Thanks for that. Right. Okay. There's a few more people joining. As I say, if you've just joined, if you could mute, please, that'd be great. Just to cut out a little bit of noise, that'd be great. Thanks very much. Okay, excellent. Right, welcome everybody. Pension Playpen Coffee Morning. Delighted to have Chloe Taylor on from Quietroom. She's the CEO of Quietroom, so we are blessed with her company. As you can see, she's a lot younger than most of us, so I'm going to be really interested and excited to hear what she has to say. Prior to this, to the start of the call, I was saying to Chloe that I think as an industry we have possibly failed a lot in terms of our communications to members and the perception of pensions in the savings industry, and I'd be delighted to hear what she has to say about it. Not only what she has to say about it, but what can we do about it? I think that's Chloe's quest. Let's call it Chloe's quest, as to what can we do about it. So in the usual fashion, we are recording. So David, Adrian, Palwinder, Podrick, are we happy to be recorded? Brian, thumbs up. Everybody's happy. We're being recorded. I'll monitor the lobby. As usual, if you want to raise a question, ask a question, challenge Chloe, agree with Chloe or whatever, then please raise a hand. I think Chloe will be presenting for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have a proper sort of Q&A session going forward. But that's enough about me. Chloe, thanks in advance, as I say. Over to you, and I will monitor the lobby.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to share some slides. So I'm hoping that everyone is going to be able to see my slides and not my notes if I do that.
Yep, all looks good.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here. So as Steve said, I'm Chloe. I'm the CEO of Quietroom. I can see a few familiar faces, but for anybody who doesn't know Quietroom and what we do, we are an insight-led communications consultancy. We specialize in pensions communications, and we do some of the insurance and investment markets as well. So these are sectors that are very technical, heavily regulated, but actually really need the people who they're serving to understand what's going on and to take some action to make the most of the products, platforms, benefits that they offer. So our job is really to help these industries and these businesses where they interact with members, with customers, and with policyholders, so that they can make the most of all the great work that the industry does. We're always thinking about driving better member outcomes, and often a really big part of that in our industry in particular, and particularly with the kind of DC world that we now live in, it's as much about driving action as it is about understanding. Recently, and I'm assuming most of you will have seen this, Pensions UK published the updated retirement living standards sort of calculations and numbers. It made the national press, the BBC picked it up pretty quickly, which is great to have a bit of pensions in the news. But when I was sort of scrolling through and I got to the comments section, the top comment that I found in that first week was frankly a little bit disheartening. I want to start with this comment because I think it probably does a better job than I ever could of capturing where a lot of people in the kind of general public are when they think about pensions. How the hell are we supposed to be saving for retirement when lots of people are struggling to survive financially day to day? This was not an unusual comment. This was not an extreme comment. And actually, it's quite a rational response to being shown a retirement target that feels totally out of reach. Quietroom, we do a lot of member testing as well, member research, and from what we've seen and what we've heard, this is actually quite a typical response. What I'm keen to do today, as well as sort of throw this in front of people, is more to think about what we can do about it, how we can make people feel more positive, but ultimately with the end intention of helping people save better for their retirement. So this isn't new. I don't think I'm necessarily showing anyone anything they've never seen before. We've known about this dynamic for a long time. We know that the gap between what people are saving and what they're going to need is there, and it's big. It's been well documented for a long time. That feeling of helplessness isn't necessarily new, but it does, I think, reinforce the need to think a bit harder and a bit deeper about how the industry can help, particularly with so much regulatory change coming down the track, which I think is pointing to solutions for this. But it's as good a time as any to think about this in this sort of light. Just briefly on the retirement living standards, that I really like them. So this is not any shade on the standards themselves. Credit where it's due. These are really robust. The kind of research and detail that's gone into them with the sort of academics behind it as well means they're really empirically grounded. Actually, they're described and explained in a way that's really accessible. They talk about real experiences behind all these abstract numbers. You know, what kind of holiday do you expect to have in retirement? My personal favorite, how much would you spend at a supermarket on a bottle of wine, which maybe says more about me than anything else, but is, I think, a very, very accessible way of helping somebody understand what they might need. It also gives the industry a kind of shared benchmark, which is very valuable. So these things are really important. And I think for what they are, these retirement living standards are expressed really well. The challenge is that they are a destination, they're not the map. So they're really valuable. They've done something really important, which is translate retirement as a sort of big, scary future thing into something concrete, a number, an income, and not talking about pot size or replacement rate, but a real way of living. That's really powerful. The challenge is that it's describing a destination, and knowing where you want to get to isn't the same as knowing how to get there, or feeling like you know how to get there, that it's easy, that it's feasible. And I think that is the place where there's more work to do, and probably is one of the reasons that you see these kinds of comments on that article in the BBC, because it's all talking about a destination that feels like the other side of the world rather than something that somebody can easily get to. So if you just take this number, this is the for one person moderate income annually. It's actually a very big number. Median gross earnings for full-time employees in 2025 was £39,039. And that means that for a lot of people, I mean, for most people, the gap between this and their current pot, and even this and their current income when they are working, feels really big. And actually, what we see time and time again when we talk about what somebody needs in retirement is that giving them that insight, that information doesn't drive action, doesn't motivate people. In fact, it sort of defeats them, makes them feel like the battle's already lost. This is too big, this is too scary. And lots of behavioral economics will tell you that when that gap feels too big, it doesn't motivate, it makes people go, well, it's never going to happen. What's the point? What's the point in trying if it's not even feasible? And I think the key insight, and I promise, start getting a bit more positive now, is it's this insight that we all sort of know, but I think this paints a very stark picture of, which is that increased awareness is not the same as increased action. They are not necessarily linked. There's nothing wrong with the retirement living standards. The failing isn't in the research. It's not in the setting of the standard that we want people to try and aspire to. It's how we're using it. And if our ambition stops at just making people aware, then we have achieved something. We might have moved from a total lack of understanding to a level of awareness, but actually what we haven't done is change the outcome. There are a small number of people who, once they understand the gap might feel motivated to do something, but we know that for the majority, that's not the case. And so if our ambition, which I think it is from so many conversations I have with people who are still in this industry after many years, is that we want people to be better off. We want to equip members of pension schemes to be better off in retirement, to have a strong financial future. And what that means is we need to move them from knowing to doing. And I think that, to pinpoint the very specific place, is where we probably fall short as an industry. The other thing just to mention is it's quite easy, I think, particularly in sort of boardrooms and big stakeholder dynamics, it can be easy to confuse awareness and action because it's much easier to measure awareness because it's binary. It's, do you understand this? Do you appreciate the gap? Have you seen it? Do you know what that number is? Whereas action, in our kind of world of something heavily regulated, lots of personal circumstances, is tricky because, and I've heard it in so many boardrooms, if you try and set one metric for what positive action looks like, there will be exceptions. Is it right for everybody to start saving more into their pension? Well, it's probably right for most people, but what if we're encouraging someone who's got vast amounts of debt? What about that? What if actually we're only seeing this fraction of someone's pension savings and they've got something over there? How do we set a really clear and concrete metric for positive action? And I think sometimes that can be a bit paralyzing in big organizations, in big schemes, but it is really the thing that's going to make the difference. I'm super keen to hear everybody's thoughts on this because it's definitely not something that the industry has nailed. I by no means I'm gonna now share an exhaustive list of how we're going to fix this, but I have got a few thoughts based on policy, based on research, which can give us some kind of positive and evidence-based ideas, thoughts, prompts that I would then love to kind of use as a springboard really to get into a discussion. Because at Quietroom we talk about the communications, but you're only ever communicating something that already exists, whether that's a platform, a product, something that the rest of the industry is building and running. So really keen to hear everybody's ideas. I think this has to be a kind of collaborative solution. So just a few thoughts as prompts before we get into a chat. The first is, and surprise, surprise, the pensions dashboard. The pensions dashboard is coming. It will be really useful. It's going to tell members what they have, where it is, and as actually an income, what it's worth. And that is really exciting. It's a really positive thing. And when it gets here, it's going to be great. But the dashboard is like the other side of the same coin as the retirement living standards. It tells you what you've got, what is true. It's great that they're both going to be talking about income in retirement rather than sort of pot size and things. I think that's really positive. But what neither of them are doing is giving you levers to change it or encouraging you or helping you think through what you might do. And actually, there's a bit of a risk, and this is both a risk and an opportunity for the industry, that when someone logs onto the dashboard for the first time, actually what they get is a terrifying reality check of what they're going to have in retirement. Particularly because pot sizes often look like big numbers. Lots of people have never had that much money in a bank account before, but when it's translated into an income and then you start looking at those big numbers in the retirement living standards, that might be quite scary. I have to credit the wonderful Vincent Franklin, one of our co-founders of Quietroom, with this metaphor, which he's been using for a very long time now, which is thinking about a car. A dashboard on a car is great. It tells you how fast you're going. It tells you if you're going to have enough fuel to get where you need to go. Some of them now even have a lovely map on them, or you can stick your sat nav in. But if you don't have a steering wheel, you can't change where you're going. You can't change your outcome. And the big question, I think, around dashboards is, what does the sort of metaphorical steering wheel look like? How do we show everybody what they're on track for and then help them feel empowered, equipped, enthused, ideally, about doing something about it and to act on what they've seen in a way that can change their financial future, not just watch as they sort of drive towards the inevitable, which might be quite a scary prospect for some people who have been under saving. So that's dashboard. The next thing, and it might feel quite small, maybe it feels too obvious, but I want to talk about it anyway, which is just the habit of saving. There's some great research out there. There's a particular piece by the Money and Pension Service which talks about how a sort of widespread habit of saving, regular saving, would be absolutely transformational for the nation's financial well-being. The habit of regular saving turns out to be one of the biggest drivers of financial resilience, more than financial education, sometimes actually more than income levels. And I think that's really interesting because it's just this sort of habit forming thing of putting a bit of money aside that can have such a massive transformation. And that feels like a small hurdle. It feels like a smaller thing to overcome. I think the challenge for me and for our industry is how you explain that people have a big gap between what they have and what they need, but are able to maybe put some smaller success milestones in there so that you don't have to go from an enormous gap to perfectly on track to feel like you've made progress, but actually what are the small steps in between? How do we encourage small kind of habitual lifestyle changes that are a valuable step, even if they're not fully adequate yet at plugging that gap? Helping someone build that habit is a massive win. Whose job is that in our industry? How can we be part of playing that role for people, particularly as savings doesn't necessarily mean pension savings in this case. So there's some brilliant stuff, obviously, with things like sidecar savings, lots of evidence around the success of those sorts of programs. But how do we as the sort of pensions bit of this ecosystem think about this? And also, how do we use something like this evidence to reframe how we measure success and set targets? What are those interim steps between not enough and enough that might be something that helps plug that gap of feeling totally resigned to not having enough money in retirement? A couple more things that are much more kind of regulatory. So the first is guided retirement. Guided retirement is great because it relies on inertia. It is sort of making the most of that auto-enrollment piece that's gone on for so long, where we know that a lot of members do nothing. And how can we sort of use that, I suppose, to help give people a better outcome in retirement? We're doing some really interesting work. It's fascinating to help schemes and organisations think through how you present guided retirement to members. And that's partly because as much as this is building on sort of defaults and inertia, how members feel about that default, how members feel about sort of being put into something is actually really important. And those sorts of things can have a massive impact on people's confidence to act later. So things like when you're put into a workplace scheme, you hear time and time again in research, members talk about the fact that they assumed that what their employer did for them would be enough. Now, we as the industry know that if that's minimum auto-enrollment standards, that is very much not enough. But we know that when people are put into something, they expect it to be good enough. And so guided retirement actually is a really great opportunity, both from a sort of pensions PR perspective, but also for genuine engagement with people's pensions to help people feel good about where we're putting them, and using that positive feeling to combat some of that fear and resigned emotions that we saw in those BBC comments, to say, let's feel a bit more positive, and with positive feeling often comes a bit more motivation to do something differently. Finally, we've got targeted support. We think it's a massive opportunity. We've always had lots of choices since the kind of DC world and pension freedoms. And we know people struggle with choice, particularly choice about something they don't think about every day, something they feel ill-equipped for. Exciting thing about targeted retirement is we're building a sort of proper framework for giving someone recommendations, a course of action, support in making that choice, not just more and more information. It's really great. It's going to be something really good. I think it's driving towards exactly what the industry needs, but it is not necessarily simple and straightforward. From a sort of communications perspective, the really big challenge is going to be treading that line between something being personalized enough to feel really relevant, to feel really credible, but not straying into the sort of financial advice, regulated advice territory. Thinking about how we do that well is a big challenge, but also a big opportunity. And I think the other thing to say on targeted support is that a lot of the conversations with it at the moment are about retirement options, are about what you do at the sort of end of your savings journey. But are there principles in here? What do the frameworks look like in terms of using this sort of, whether it's just the principles of it or whether it's the actual targeted support framework, to help people save better as well? How do we help them earlier in their journey, where we can probably make a bigger impact for the sort of next generation of savers? And it wouldn't be a slide deck if I didn't mention AI. But I think on top of this, particularly with targeted support, actually the evolution of AI is giving us a really great opportunity. AI is not a silver bullet. Let's be really honest about that. There's a lot of hype in this space. It can be quite overwhelming, but I do think that this is going to unlock something that is quite exciting for our industry and quite important for our industry in this sort of new world of more choice, of bigger sort of gaps between people's savings. And that is the big thing for me, because we know personalization drives better outcomes for people. People are more likely to respond to something that feels tailored, targeted, specific to them. It is what they expect from all of their services now, not just sort of Amazon and consumer services, but their banks and other financial institutions too. And what AI does is unlocks the opportunity to be personalized and targeted at scale in a way that before has been maybe very expensive or very time intensive. So we know that things work better when they're targeted, and AI is going to let us do that. It also gives us much better tools for data capture and analytics, which is exciting too. So while we talk about, no one understands it, or no one's saving, there will always be bright spots, pockets of things that are going well, that if we can use some of the new technology to dig deeper into those correlated data sets, you can start to learn more about what works and what doesn't, and double down on the things that work, do more live testing as members engage more digitally with schemes. There's loads of opportunity here, but it's more an enabler, I would say, than a sort of silver bullet that's going to transform the way people think about their benefits. Side note, even if you're not using AI, your members are putting pensions information and financial information into things like ChatGPT, and ChatGPT will offer to basically tell them what to do, will offer to model their benefits. So that is a bit of a risk, but it also, I think, tells us what members are looking for. They are looking for help, guidance, support, and so I do think targeted support is going to be a really great thing. I'm really keen to hear everyone else's ideas. Sort of close with some of the questions that I started with. I don't have all the answers, but I would love to hear from everybody. A few questions just up here to, I suppose, prompt some thinking. How do we help people navigate this really tough situation? It's not straightforward. It's not a simple decision-making framework where everyone should do the same thing. So how do we help people make good choices? How do we acknowledge the struggle while driving action? We know that people find it tough to put money aside, and sometimes when we don't acknowledge that, we see these sorts of comments where people think, you don't understand, I'm not even going to bother. But also we know that we need to drive action. So how do we find that balance in the way that we're communicating with members that feels doable, but also feels like we understand their situation? And then how do we know that what we're doing is working? How do we know that what we're doing is improving outcomes? How do we set success measures that don't immediately get diluted because of the complexity of the pensions world, the complexity of personal circumstances, so that even if we're not doing things perfectly, we know that we're moving forward and moving the dial? These are sorts of questions that I think about all the time, but I would love to hear about how other people are thinking about them from other parts of the industry, from other bits of insight that people have, but also really happy to just sort of answer any questions and have a big open discussion with the time we've got left. So I think I'm going to hand back to Steve, who's going to help chair some discussion.
Thanks, Chloe. Really, really good presentation as usual, and as expected. Huge issue for the industry. I probably, in our sort of possibly 3 years of Playpen, never seen so much chat in such short period of time. We've got an immense amount of comments, and obviously we can download these for you, which I think will be quite useful. Lots of stuff going on with Peter, Brian, Jim. If anybody wants to raise a hand, Gillian, you put lots of stuff in the chat as well. Roger, anybody wants to raise a hand and make their point. I think it'd be really, really useful sort of kickstart. Where do we go from here? Because this is huge. This is massive. Podreg, let's start with you because you put your hand up first. Then we come to Brian.
Thank you, Steve. Chloe, I've heard Vincent's analogy about using a steering wheel in the past, and I think it's interesting that you should use the car as visual clue there. The thing about dashboard is you use that when you are actively using a steering wheel. So you've already made an active decision to do something, to start that car and start a journey. We're still talking about the problem of getting people into that car in the first place. Now you've managed to avoid it in your discussion, but have you got any insights into how we can actually get people to start to understand that they're going to be living for a long time, potentially? The government isn't going to pay the kind of pension in retirement, or their employer is going to deliver them the kind of lifestyle they may have been used to when they're working. So what do we do about that kind of communication? Because the kind of communication we've been doing is to people that have got their fingers in their ears for the last however many years. What's your take on that? Because that is the hardest thing to do, but it's really the thing we need to get through first. We either tell people that they need to do something for their future, or we go down more guided or use inertia to our benefit, and we stop trying to tell people. We just put them into something that's going to be good for them, like they received when they were in DB. What's your point of view from a communicator's point of view?
There's a couple of things there, I think. There's one which is about ownership of outcomes, which I think is a really interesting one. And I was talking to, I think it was Daniela Silcock, who was talking about the sort of the UK's model has a really unusual dynamic of where the ownership of outcomes lives, because we have a state pension. So there's a level of sort of government oversight and ownership of making sure people have enough in retirement. They've also mandated a level of employer sort of provision. So employers are also on the hook for a level of income and a level of contribution. But ultimately, we still talk a lot about, particularly in this DC world, members being in control of their destiny, in charge of how much they save. Really, the auto enrollment minimums aren't enough. So there is this slightly confused dynamic of who's in charge of making this work, who's in charge of people having enough. And ultimately, if no one else is looking after it, then members sort of have to step up while everyone else in the ecosystem incrementally changes things. So I do think there's this sort of complexity of who's doing enough and being maybe more explicit sometimes about, particularly with sort of as people are enrolled, as people join, you are on the hook for thinking about this. I don't know exactly how you communicate that well, but I think that is one of the pieces of the puzzle. People talk about other countries a lot, and one of the benefits of some of the overseas models is that there's real clarity on who owns whether people have enough in retirement. The US is very individualist. You are on the hook for whether you have enough. Australia, they've sort of put all the onus on employers, and so employers are there to look out for people, and everyone knows sort of where that ownership lies. That's not really an answer to how we solve it, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about when we're thinking about what the solve is for these sorts of things. When it comes to how we get people to just think about it in the first place, how do you get someone in the car, to kind of use your analogy? I think the big thing for me is that people do know they need to do something. So all the research that we do, all the testing that we do, even in these comments, everyone goes, oh, I know I need to do something about this. Oh, I know this is important. I know I should probably get out those letters. I know I should probably log into the portal. But there are two big barriers in the way, one of which is it's really hard. So much of the tech, the platforms, remembering your password, making sure it all works, means that people have to actually invest a disproportionate amount of time to just get in and get the information they want, to change the thing, to do the thing. And so I think there's one which is about how we make it really easy, how we make it feel really straightforward. And then the other thing is giving someone a rule of thumb. So a lot of things talk about, go and review your contributions. Could you contribute more? And the first question somebody has is, well, what's more? What's enough? And if you're asking people to go and find all these disparate pieces of information and pull them together, frankly, they're not going to. Now, yes, some of that is on them, but the question I think for us as an industry is how you make it, one, as easy as possible to do something about it, and two, that you paint someone a picture of what good looks like. But you paint someone a picture of what good looks like in a way that feels feasible, and that might mean laddering slowly up to what we think the right answer is, because if we go from 0 to 100, it might feel like too much. There is no silver bullet, and it will look slightly different for different parts of the ecosystem, but those are kind of initial thoughts, I think, on that initial barrier of just getting someone to think about it in the first place.
Well, Drake, you happy with that?
Well, of course, I'm not happy with it, Steve, because we're still not going to we're not going to solve the problem. But you know, I think we do spend too much time. Chloe's right about it being confused, but the one word she didn't use in all that was the R word, responsibility. I'm all for consumer protection, but we have too much of it, really, in certain ways in the UK. We need to place a bit more consumer responsibility on the individual consumer, and we don't talk about that R word enough. So if we tell people, just like government's been doing with them, get your taxes sorted out, you're going to have to file them digitally. We should be starting younger, saying people, you're going to need to sort this out, start getting on with it. Now, otherwise, what we do is we communicate to 100% of people, and about 5% of them might be switched on enough to actually jump through the hoops that's required of them. So anyway, but no, I'm not satisfied, but that's not your fault or anybody else's here. That's just the way it is.
Yep, I get that. Frustrations coming out, I guess. Brian, you're next, and then we'll come on to Billy.
Yeah, thank you. Really good, Chloe. Thank you very much. Really interesting. I used to work for Money Helper till about 6 months ago, when I retired with a strictly moderate standard of living. And the way I managed to get to moderate, always having had a moderate standard of living, was to understand about pensions, obviously being in the industry, to take on board, and I was nodding at you, Podrick, about responsibility. It's my responsibility to do something with what I know, and to use my knowledge by taking action. And one of the really good things about Money Helper, apart from it was free, was that if somebody were to take up the chance to pick up the phone and speak to someone like myself, what we tried to do was not just say, well, we used the retirement living standards, by the way, and we tried to explain to them what they were, but then we spoke to them about, well, what are you doing about your retirement? What's your situation? And trying to give them practical solutions, and talking them through what I consider to be a deeply inadequate retirement calculator on the Money Helper website. And so what interested me about what you were saying, very long-winded question here, was you talking about the targeted retirement and helping people take positive action. Could you give a little bit more detail about that, and also explain how an ordinary person would get access to this kind of information and help?
Yeah, so the targeted support piece is a really interesting one. It's a kind of, obviously, it's new regulatory framework that's allowing FCA regulated businesses. So this is the other fun dynamic that we're navigating, which is the kind of double regulated system. But what under the FCA, that ability to effectively go much closer to the advice guidance boundary. So able to give a much more personalized, tailored recommendation to members in a way that doesn't constitute paid for financial advice. So because we know that although for lots of people, financial advice would be very beneficial, there's people don't take it. People don't feel like they get value for money. There's this kind of weird barrier there for lots of people. So it's getting closer to that advice line to be able to recommend things. Now, at the moment, most of what we're seeing in targeted support is actually more around things like ISA journeys. You know, should you buy an ISA? Much less complex than how should you take your income? How should you take your income in retirement? How should you turn that into kind of products and decisions? So it's still actually relatively early days from a targeted support perspective. But the ability that it will have for people to go through a sort of decision-making journey that is not full fat financial advice, but is very good guidance around what choices they've got available and what might be good choices for them, I think is going to be very beneficial. Because the other thing that sometimes I think our industry gets a bit hung up on is perfectly optimizing at the risk of slightly disenfranchising. So, you know, technically, for the perfect optimum pound value for you in retirement, you should be doing a bit of this and a bit of that. At retirement, you should have this, and you should have this slightly complex product over here, and you should change it over here, or you should take this option, because although it will need more management from you, it will get you an ultimately greater income. But what we see time and time again is that sometimes that optimization is traded off against people feeling confident, feeling in control of their finances as they go through into retirement. So targeted support, although it's not perfect, and it won't be perfect because it's not perfectly personalized financial advice, will give more people a better and probably, frankly, earlier decision-making process into retirement income. There was some brilliant research by Ignition House a few years ago of people that just weren't retiring. You know, they just were paralyzed by the idea of deciding how to take their money, and people were saying, oh, I've stopped working and I'm just living off my savings because I'm just too stressed out by the options of how to take my DC pot, or I've just carried on working because actually I just don't have the energy to go through that decision making. And targeted support at retirement will do, I think, a lot to serve that population of people who feel ill-equipped to make that decision. But I guess I'm also thinking, how do you use that sort of framework to change people's total value much earlier in their journey? And I don't think that's really started yet, because everyone's focused in those kind of big ticket moments at the end of your savings journey. But that's sort of how I'm seeing that play out at the moment.
Yeah. Do you sort of get involved with big or even medium-sized employers as one of the, and indeed pension providers? Because one of the things I feel is that having been an advisor and then a guider, people don't realise how close you can get to advice without crossing the line. And I think one of the problems of the regulator and the way their tone of their communications, the FCA and people such as that, is they make providers scared to actually do as much as they can. So you can say, well, how much do I need to put in approximately to get to a figure of this? Oh, I can't tell you that. That's advice. No, it isn't. It's information. And if you can use a universally accepted calculator that shows them, advice is saying, and I think you should do this and you should not do that. But to actually answer someone's question is giving them information. And I think that as well as having good tools for communication, we also need to communicate to regulators and to providers and indeed pension scheme administrators. You can actually do more than you're currently doing. Because I totally agree. There's such a big gap. And I wonder if you're working with pension providers, pension scheme administrators, employers, to help them realise that you can do a lot more than you're doing to help your staff, particularly vis-a-vis the big one I can think of was a disaster many years ago of the British Steel chicken and chip scandal, where in effect the trustees abdicated responsibility because they said, I can't do this, I can't do that.
Yeah,
that's sorry. Yeah.
Okay, Brian, thank you. Billy, will come to you now, and then Bryn will come to you next, and then I think Jim's in the queue. So Billy, you go first, then we'll come to Bryn.
Right. Well, Chloe, sorry I missed the first bit. I was actually with a client talking about rules of thumbs and what have you. I guess sort of my question is that I really understand, pension wise, and I understand guided journeys. But the truth of the matter is they don't give people what they want. What people want is for someone to help them decide what to do. I guess sort of my big point here is that, do you think that we're over-regulated? I like what Patrick says about responsibility, and I mean I would use the advice word, and wouldn't I say this? And if I had my way, I would make it easier for people to give advice. And see, I mean, I love pension wise, but the truth is, you take someone down a pension wise, and you get to the end, they say, well, thank you very much. You've explained my options, but what do you think's best for me? And you say, well, I can't tell you that. And of course, what do people want? They want to have a freewheeling, conversation. So how do we make a world where it's easier for people to have advice? It's easier for people to have a free-flowing conversation. And if you want to get people in the car, I think you've got to speak to them, and decision trees are great. And one of the things that perhaps the industry doesn't really understand, that even people with lots of money and very clever people don't understand some of the basic concepts. So I've just had a conversation with a client, and he was actually a consultant in the industry, and he said, "Well, just remind me again, what happens if I die after the age of 75?" And you think, well, if something as simple as that doesn't register with people, anyway, I'll stop going on there.
No, I think that's such an astute observation, though, and so often I think that's why you just go, I don't think it is really an education problem. It's a really complex industry. What people want is help at the point of use, and a little bit of education as they go through their savings journey, but nobody is going to sit down and learn loads about their pensions, and kind of, nor should they have to necessarily, in my view as well. I think a few sort of things to pick up on what you've said. So one is, I do think the industry is moving towards the advice line more and more. I think targeted support is really a stepping stone. This is murmurings in the industry of whether particularly the big sort of master trust and providers are going to be able to get to a point where they can give much cheaper financial advice on DC savings. And I think targeted support is likely a stepping stone in what really becomes, whatever you want to call it, sort of mass financial advice that is able to go further than guidance, but is able to be more affordable to people, and just lower that barrier to entry. I also think, though, from a communications perspective, and this is sort of touching on what Brian was saying as well, there's a big difference between consistently saying, I can't give you advice, I can't tell you what to do, I can't give you advice, and designing a journey for people that feels incredibly helpful and is personalized and targeted without straying into advice. And I think that if targeted support is done really, really well, that is what that is going to look like, which is holding somebody's hand through a journey that is probably pretty good for them, that is based on personal characteristics, but not whole of wealth advice, but which for most people will feel absolutely good enough and will leave them going, yes, great, I can understand why you've made this recommendation based on these bits about me, and I feel kind of good about that with my DC pot. So I do think there's this interplay of the evolution of actually the industry of advice and guidance and what people can offer. I think there's a lot of technology that will enable that to get better and accelerate our ability to do it for cheaper. But I also think there's loads you can do within the current framework that is just about how we present recommendations and guidance without straying into advice, and also without consistently saying, I've given you all the information, I can't give you advice, and saying, here's some help I can give you, here's some support I can give you. And I think there is regulation to sort of navigate with that, but I think it's very doable. A bit, to Brian's point earlier, I think some of that is the risk appetite of trustees and the risk appetite of people that are running these organizations. But also, I think technology is going to enable us to do it at scale in a way that before was pretty tough. So we're absolutely on the road to there. And I do think the regulators are pointing in that direction, both the FCA and TPR, but it, as ever, will be slow to get to the end goal. So a lot of what we're thinking about is how do you stick within the current regime and the current frameworks and use the way you talk about things, the way you communicate things and design journeys to make people feel more like they're getting the help they want.
Good,
Thank you, Chloe. Okay, thank you. Cheers, Billy. Bryn, over to you. Sorry for the wait. And Jim will come to you. Bryn first and then Jim. The Bryn and Jim show.
Yeah. Thanks. That's great. A lot of good stuff in the talk. I hope that it's been put together and to produce a useful submission to the Second Pensions Commission. I don't know if that's on the agenda, but I would strongly recommend that you tell them what you've told us. Pensions advice, I don't give pensions advice. Echoes of equitable life still petrify me, so I don't give people pensions advice. But I do say that if you're asking how to get anywhere between a moderate, whatever the income standards between moderate and good, if the person you're talking to about it, when you tell them how much they should pay, they need to pay. If they don't say how much with several exclamation marks, you're not telling them enough. Dashboards, we've been waiting a long time to dashboards. They've always had promise. For a lot of people, the rational response to seeing their figures on the dashboard is we've got a campaign for a better state pension. I've always, going back decades since we first had the single pension statement years and years ago, people, the state pension will appear on there and people will think, well, is that enough? So I think there will be that impact once people start using it. I disagree with Patrick about responsibility. It's not the answer to provide everyone with a decent pension. Of course, people should take responsibility, but some people don't have the scope to exercise that responsibility. So telling them they should be more responsible is not a helpful way forward for large numbers of people.
Okay, Bryn, thank you very much for your comment there. Appreciate that. Jim, do you want to go next? And then we'll come on to Peter.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Chloe. That's really interesting stuff. We do have slightly different ones in the public sector, in that partly it is trying to get people to understand how good the pensions are for them. I really like the work that Laura Bowler does in this space from Pengage, and what she says to people is that you need to know your number. So I think the retirement living standards do give people an idea, and then they can kind of tweak their way around it. But the sort of the part that I think people often miss is the control they have over what they spend. So I think budgeting and thinking about what your budget would be in retirement compared to what it is in working life is probably a part that we don't spend enough time sort of focusing on for people. So I don't know if you have anything to say on that, Chloe.
Yeah, I think that is one of the things that the retirement living standards are trying to do, is sort of give someone a sense of what your budget might look like in retirement. There's a lot of complexity there. Home ownership, I think there was a comment in the chat about this, assumes home ownership dramatically different if you're single or in a two-person household, care costs not factored in, all of these sorts of things. I suppose the challenge is always going to be, I mean, you've got two options, right? If you've not got enough, is you downgrade the amount you're going to spend, or you save more beforehand. In that sort of, and what's difficult is, in a simple way, giving both options sort of together. And I do think modelers can be deceptive, because people aren't in control of all the variables. People don't know what's coming down the track. I think it's helpful to basically help people understand what they can do now, for most of the time that they're saving. So we know there's behavioural biases all over the place, lots of research that will tell you that when people think about themselves in retirement, they think of them like another person. It doesn't feel like themselves. So the way that we talk about saving for the future has to be slightly different to when you get there, what you might talk about in terms of budgets. And I think while we want to use, it can be useful to talk about income and retirement and what your budget might look like, actually, is that a bit of a red herring, when what we're really hoping people will do now is save more and put more away and think about what they can do in terms of savings and sort of financial resilience for their future. I think it's helpful to have an idea of what you're aiming for, but I think there might be a risk that in giving people too much in terms of modelling retirement budgets, that if they're in their 20s, 30s, even 40s, they go, oh, well, I can just do less of this and less of that. And if I just do this, then I'm fine with what I'm getting at the moment. Whereas I think most of the industry would say, what I'm not looking to do is downgrade people's saving ambitions. I'm looking to do whatever they can now. And of course, there are options for budgets in retirement, but more actually coming back to that research around savings habits. How do we help people budget and save now and instill that discipline in something that feels like it's got payoff for me in my life currently, but that is also contributing to probably skills habits that will help me in retirement, because I do think there's a little bit of risk if we effectively palm off the problem on ourselves in X number of years' time, because I think that's a surefire way to get people to not act now.
Agreed. Okay, thanks for that, Chloe. Peter?
Yeah, thank you very much. Coming from a background of DB, which unashamedly I have been, I find this a little bit strange that we seem to be reinventing wheels. And the point I'm picking up on Jim's point, perhaps for the younger, perhaps we should actually go back to the old parental advices. I don't mind who you work for, son, but please go and get one with a pension, an occupational pension. And you should encourage them to think about, when thinking about employment, thinking about the pension promise provided by the employer. Now, the reaction of that is we could end up with an Australian situation where all the mandatory contributions are all on the employer. The 12% contributions, auto-enrolment equivalent, are all employer contributions. So that is one way of overcoming that sort of personal age thing. And the second thing is DB pensions are cumulative. So there's no small pots issue with DB pensions, that you can retain them to retirement with some index protection. And secondly, all the way through, you have a clear indication of what your retirement income is. And if you feel if you're capable and feel you're in a position to enhance that, then there's other ways of AECs or private pension policies that you can top up that income on a personal basis. But you have this fundamental. That leads to difficulty about the low paid and those that are not in employment for whatever reason, and whether there is any mechanism we could get to avoid the problem in Australia that self-employed don't pay into the pension contributions, and then therefore they end up with a state pension that's means tested, and that's seen as very jealously by employees in employment, who say, why should they get a state pension when they have not contributed, or their employers contributed, when we don't? So there are political issues like that. I haven't got a solution to the problem, except perhaps we should be encouraging employers to really look at the efficiency of their contributions that they're paying into pensions, and whether the employers are the ones that could take the responsibility for ensuring the best possible pension outcome for their employees in the future. But those are my observations and comments.
Thank you, Peter. Chloe, anything to add to that, or should we move on to Chris?
No, I think that's a big question for another day. The structure of our system.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry,
yeah, go on, Peter. Sorry.
No, I was just saying sorry about that. Yeah, I can't get it out of my head. Perhaps this is because of the background I come from, but yeah.
Yeah, fair comment. Okay. Chris, we'll come to you, and then we'll come to Christos. So, and then we'll probably need to wrap up. Well, Adrian's up as well. So anyway, yeah.
Thanks, Steve. Just on this question of boosting contributions and adequacy, I do believe it's very closely linked to engagement. And I do believe engagement improves the closer you get to the event. So in other words, don't worry about those in their 20s and 30s who may not be contributing enough. Ideally, yes, they could save more, but they're still paying their 9% graduate tax and all the rest of it. So when they get to their 50s, I haven't got any stats on this, but I intuitively think that a lot of people in their 50s must be inheriting property, significant sums of money from the generation now in their 80s who own their own houses. And I suspect a lot of those people in their 50s don't realise that they can top up pension contribution to 100% of salary up to £60,000. And for a lot of people, putting an extra 20, 30, 40,000 or whatever into a pension for 2 or 3 years, say, could make quite a significant difference to their retirement. So I have tried, while the inheritance tax bill was going through, or the provisions were going through, I have sort of lobbied a bit, but I'm not sure it got anywhere, is the question of introducing something I call personal pension relief. So similar to private residence relief on IHT, but specifically not as a general allowance, but for allowing people to contribute directly into the pension funds of their beneficiaries rather than give them the money through the estate. And I think that could make quite a significant difference to the generation that's coming up to retirement. That's the most important generation, let's face it. It's those in the next 10, 15 years who are going to be hurt most by any shortfall.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I think there's a surprising number of people that won't inherit anything, or will or might inherit something and need it for sort of day-to-day living, or the property they don't own that isn't factored into any of these standards. So I think that is true, but probably doesn't answer the question for the people with the biggest adequacy gaps, who are still quite likely not to be in a position where there's any sort of meaningful inheritance, or if there is, it's the thing that plugs the gap from their moderate standard, meaning going up into the sort of 45 to 50 grand because they don't own a property yet, and those sorts of things. So but this is why this personalization piece I think is so important, because if you start talking to someone who's not in that position about those options, it's even more disenfranchising, but it's a huge opportunity for people who are in that position that we don't want to be overlooked for somebody when they're sort of planning for their retirement income and looking at things like inheritance. So I think that for me is a big case of how do we better tailor and target people with these messages so that we don't end up having to choose one group over the other in terms of useful and positive information we're giving them.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking so much choosing one over another. I was just putting forward ideas that I thought must impact a significant proportion. Even if it's only a third of the people, they will still be probably shorter than what the retirement living standards say it would be a comfortable retirement. But ultimately, what's a comfortable retirement to anybody is presumably something that allows them to continue their lifestyle pre-retirement. So if you're on a 6-figure salary pre-retirement and you're told, oh, you're all right on 50k afterwards, well, you might not think so, might you? Similarly, other people who are on 30k, if they were suddenly, oh, I could boost myself to 50k, wouldn't that be wonderful? But no, they might be quite happy with their 30k. Depends where you are pre-retirement as to how you see things post-retirement. And if the income is just purely an adjustment of course living expenses or working expenses mainly, the rest of your lifestyle you would probably want to keep.
That is probably true, Chris. Absolutely. Okay, thanks you. Thanks, Chris, for that. Christos, you go, and then Adrian, and then we'll have to wrap up, I think. But Christos, you go next.
Yeah, I think just the exchange now between Chris and Chloe, I think demonstrates that in fact what we're dealing with is not one problem. We're dealing with a problem that manifests itself in different ways across different cohorts, and even within cohorts there may be different groups that experience the adequacy or inadequacy in a different way, which suggests to me at least that if we have multiple manifestations of the problem, we have to look at different tools that we can use to deal with the different ways that people experience this problem. So I think Chris's suggestion, for example, is one that would benefit some people, but it wouldn't benefit others. And there will be other, younger cohorts, for example, for whom there is more time to actually save more, as and when they're able to do and they're able to afford it. And with different structures, CDC coming, for example, could allow them to have more, at the time of, a bigger amount at the time of, of when the accumulation starts. So I just hope that the new pensions commission that is doing its work now, that it will perhaps for the first time, when it comes to these matters, the accumulation, look at the evidence and drive policy based on data rather than conviction. You know, we had initially annuitization, which was paternalism, and then we had freedoms pensions, and both of them are kind of philosophical positions. They're not really policy making that is driven by data and by you know, taking into account the empirical evidence. So, you know, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Christos. Okay, Adrian,
Yeah.
you're the last. Best till last, Adrian. Best till last.
We shall see. Yeah, just a very quick question, I guess. Just back to the your points about responsibility. Just the question I have is, can fear and instilling a sense of fear ever make a difference? You know, for example, to any cohorts, you know, Chloe, which you've had a look at, or is it just a non-starter? You know, for example, painting a picture of the retirement track which you're on now, unless you do something, is pretty grim and bleak, and therefore I should be fearful, or is it just a non-starter?
I think the only way, and I don't have anything super empirical at my fingertips to back this up, but just based on what I do know, so pinch of salt, but I'll take it away, is that people do want the truth. So it's not always helpful to sort of obfuscate people. You know, it's important that people understand things. Fear without any tools or guidance to do something to change it is a non-starter, I think, because the reason people end up in this scenario is because they're ill-equipped to do something about it, worried about doing the wrong thing, low levels of sort of confidence in changing the outcome. But there is, I think, a possibility of sort of showing people the gap and generating a level of motivation if you can give people things that feel really feasible, doable, practical, and easy steps to move forward. You know, people talk about things like, there's so much work done in the retail space about things like weight loss, you know, couch to 5K, all of these things where you go, yes, if you have had a really sedentary lifestyle, you've never run a 5K, that's kind of terrifying. But the app is like, the first thing you do is you basically go on some walks and you do some really small things. It's not denying that you've got a long way to go, but it's giving you something really tangible, really practical, really doable in your first week, and giving you a sense of achievement and a sense of value. Someone also earlier mentioned, I think it was you, Peter, like appreciating the benefit you do have, appreciating the value of what you have got. And I think it's not a total non-starter so long as you've got some hope, some sort of light at the end of the tunnel. And that is a lot about the way you frame things, the way you paint the picture. But ultimately is, what are we doing to serve people? How do we help them take that first step, second step, third step? And that is something that historically the industry's found difficult. But I think with the sort of scale tests with master trusts and the technology they've got available, the data they've got available, that is becoming something that's much more achievable for the industry to start doing better.
Absolutely, Chloe. Yeah. If you could, we've got 1 more minute. Let's say 1 more minute. If you could name 2 things with a magic wand, what would you, Chloe, the magic wand, what could you change to make people understand pensions and be more responsible, I guess, is what Padraig's original point was. Magic wand, what would the magic wand be?
So I think you've got to split it into 2 categories. I think starting well, so it being a bigger part of starting your first job, it being a bigger part of thinking about pay in your first job, a lot what Peter was saying, but even in a DC world, this is a great benefit. This is really important, understanding what you're getting and how valuable that benefit is, so that it becomes something you hold on to, not something you suddenly start thinking about when you're, as Chris was saying, getting to retirement and suddenly you're engaged. So how do you build it in to be more a part of an employer package, so that people really value it alongside their salary, are more likely to contribute pay rises and those sorts of things? Those are ultimately the thing that's going to make the biggest difference, is people saving more in the long run. So I think that would be my magic wand number 1, is the kind of newer generation coming through and saving properly and appreciating it and engaging with it, not every day, but enough to do something meaningful. looking at the job spec to see what the pension contributions are, not thinking of it as a hygiene factor. And then the second thing for people that are getting closer to those decision points, I think, is just feeling like they know where to go and that they're going to get something useful. Because there's so many times where someone says, oh, I tried, but it wasn't useful, but someone gave me a pack of 30 pages and I didn't know what to do, and so I've done nothing. And so that would be my second thing, would be people feeling like there's someone holding their hand without straying over any regulatory boundaries, so that they can do the best with what they've got, because they probably can't move the dial loads, but if they can feel confident that they've made good choices, feeling good in retirement is just as important, I think, as having every possible pound you could have squeezed out of your pension pot.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, well, Chloe, thank you very much indeed for your presentation. I'm sure everybody will give you actual claps, virtual claps, and you know, we'll have enjoyed your presentation very, very much. Are you happy to share the slides? Are we happy to send the slides out, Chloe? Is that okay?
Yeah, they're mostly just pictures, but I'm very happy to share,
Well,
them
fine.
for any of those.
If anybody wants the slides to nudge them in the right direction, then email myself or Henry Tapper, and we will get the slides over to you if you'd like to request them. The video today will be up in the next hour on the Pension Playpen website. And Chloe, thank you so much for your presentation. We could have probably gone on for another hour easily, I think, to be fair. It's a massive issue, and we need as an industry to do something about it. So really appreciate your input, and thank you very much indeed for your time.
No, well, thanks for having me.
Let's pray for peace in the East. We've got peace in the Middle East, sort of. Let's pray for peace in the East. So there we go. Good stuff. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day, Chloe. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining. And thanks, everybody, for your input and your questions. But really fantastic. And come on, England, tomorrow night. There we go. That's the World Cup bit put in as well. There we are. So, yeah. Thanks, Chloe. Take care, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye. Bye.